Right now, you might be having a drink, or perhaps you're planning to later tonight. The last time you enjoyed a beer or a glass of wine, you probably didn't think twice about it. But that simple act is actually one of the oldest traditions in human history. In fact, it's older than writing, older than agriculture, and it actually predates the existence of human beings altogether. Our deep connection with alcohol didn't begin a few millennia ago with the first vineyards or breweries. It actually started roughly 10 million years ago on the African forest floor, when an early primate picked up a piece of fallen fruit that had been left in the sun a little too long. In 2014, UC Berkeley biologist Robert Dudley published a groundbreaking book titled The Drunken Monkey. His premise was straightforward. When ripe fruit drops from a tree and sits on the ground, its natural sugars begin to break down. Wild yeast enters the mix, fermentation kicks in, and the fruit generates trace amounts of ethanol. When our distant ancestors ate this fermented fruit, that ethanol gave them a slight buzz. They didn't understand the chemistry, but they knew it felt good, so they kept seeking it out. Over millions of years, primates didn't just learn to tolerate alcohol, they evolved to actively hunt for it. By the time anatomically modern humans finally arrived on the scene, our craving for alcohol was already hardwired into our biology. It existed long before anyone ever figured out how to brew it intentionally. So, when did we learn to make it on purpose? In 2018, archaeologists were excavating Raqefet Cave near Haifa, Israel, a site used by a semi-nomadic culture known as the Natufians about 13,000 years ago. Inside, researchers discovered stone mortars carved right into the bedrock. When they analyzed the microscopic residue left inside those mortars, they uncovered traces of wild wheat and barley that had been soaked, sprouted, and left to ferment. That is beer, brewed inside a cave 13,000 years ago. What makes this discovery so revolutionary is that the Natufians were not farmers. Agriculture hadn't been invented yet. They were hunter-gatherers, foraging for wild grains and hunting wild game. They didn't cultivate the barley, they gathered it from the wild. Yet, creating alcohol was important enough to them that they mastered the brewing process first. For generations, the standard historical narrative went like this. Humans settled down. They invented agriculture and built villages. Eventually, they discovered fermentation and started drinking. But Raqefet Cave flips that timeline on its head. These people were brewing beer while they were still nomadic. And they weren't alone. Roughly 1,000 years later, in southeastern Turkey, ancient humans constructed something monumental. At a site called Göbekli Tepe, massive stone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, were arranged in precise circles and intricately carved with images of wild animals. It was a highly sophisticated, deliberate architectural feat, built before farming, before pottery, and before anyone in the region had a permanent home. For years, experts couldn't explain why nomadic hunter-gatherers would organize the massive amount of labor required to haul 10-ton monoliths up a hill. What could possibly motivate that? Then, archaeologists discovered giant stone vats at the site. When they tested the interiors, they found chemical markers of fermented grain. People were brewing alcohol at Göbekli Tepe, and not in small batches, but in massive quantities meant for large crowds. The reigning theory today is that this wasn't a residential settlement. It was a sanctuary for rituals and massive festivals. People traveled from all over the region to gather, feast, and drink. This brings us to a massive debate that has occupied historians for decades. Why did humans switch to farming in the first place? Dr. Patrick McGovern, a leading archaeobotanist and the world's foremost expert on ancient alcohol, has spent his career arguing a fascinating point. Humans didn't domesticate grain to bake bread. They did it to brew beer. Making bread is a tedious, multi-step chore. You have to grind the grain, knead the dough, and bake it. Brewing beer is actually simpler. You just soak the grain in water, walk away, and let wild fermentation do the work. McGovern argues that the desire to get buzzed would have been a far more powerful motivator for our ancestors than the desire to eat grain in a slightly different format. If his theory holds true, alcohol isn't a byproduct of civilization. It might actually be the catalyst that created it. By 700 BCE, the evidence becomes incredibly precise. In a Neolithic village called Jiahu in central China, archaeologists unearthed pottery vessels containing residues of a fermented cocktail made from rice, honey, grapes, and hawthorn berries. This stands as the oldest chemically confirmed alcohol recipe in human history. And it wasn't a crude accident. It was a complex blend. These ingredients were deliberately selected and precisely combined. Whoever brewed this knew exactly what they were doing. From there, the ancient world completely embraced alcohol. By the peak of ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just a recreational beverage. It was the backbone of society. As currency, The laborers who constructed the pyramids of Giza weren't paid in coins. They were paid in beer, receiving roughly 4 to 5 liters a day. For hydration, the water from the Nile River was frequently contaminated and dangerous to drink. Because the brewing process boiled the water, beer was sterile and safe, keeping people alive in a way raw water couldn't. For nutrition, ancient beer was thick and unfiltered, packed with essential calories, vitamins, and nutrients. For a laborer dragging massive limestone blocks through the desert heat, beer wasn't just a drink, it was liquid lunch. As medicine and faith, the Egyptians believed beer was a divine gift from the god Osiris. It was used in holy temple offerings, buried in tombs for the afterlife, and used by doctors who mixed medicinal herbs into beer to treat everything from digestive issues to infections. In ancient Egypt, a single beverage served as your paycheck, your water filter, your nutrition, your medicine, and your prayer, all served in the same cup. When you look at the grand timeline, it all connects. 10 million years ago, your primate ancestors sought out fermented fruit because it helped them survive. 13,000 years ago, humans were deliberately brewing in caves before they ever planted a seed. 12,000 years ago, they built the first massive monuments in human history likely to have a place to drink together. 9,000 years ago, they were mastering complex mixology recipes. 5,000 years ago, entire empires were powered by it. Alcohol didn't appear after we built modern society. There is a very real chance that we built modern society just so we could have a steady supply of alcohol. Every time you raise a glass, you are participating in a ritual that began long before our species even had a name.